After a year of so much violence and so many shootings nationwide and so many racial comments and accusations in the presidential election, I sat down for a conversation with Bishop Talbert Swan, president of the NAACP in Springfield. We started with his thoughts and concerns about the state of racial relations in our country right now.
America is completely polarized. It's divided across racial lines. The late, great W.E.B. Du Bois once said that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. He wrote that over 100 years ago. And it's, to me, a shocking disgrace that a century after he wrote that, it is just as applicable today as it was then, because the problem in America is still the problem of the color line.
Of course, what's brought much of this into focus has been the presidential election. But before that, during that, we saw something that's gone on for a very long time, but it's really come into sharper focus now that everybody walks around basically with a TV camera on their phone. So we see the things you might have heard about, or in a lot of cases, you didn't hear about in the past. Incidents involving white police and black or brown, Latino, people of color being mistreated, in many cases shot, in some cases murder charges have been brought. There are bad relationships, obviously, in most, well, let's say many areas of the country, to be fair, between the police and the black and Latino communities. Clearly, that's something that's aggravated. And now we've had a presidential election where some very racist things, and I don't think there's any other way to put it, were said by the man who ended up winning the election and by some of the people around him since and before. That's got to aggravate where we're at.
Well, you know, you talked about the cameras and the use of them in contemporary society. The irony of that is, though you have a camera in everyone's hand, and though much of what has always been happening is now captured on video, you can see incidents regarding the police. You can hear elected officials using racial epithets, and you can catch people red-handed in some bad behavior. But the irony of it is, the portion of America that was in denial about the level of racial hatred in America is still in denial, even when it's in living color in front of your face. Even when Eric Garner is choked to death on film, even when Walter Scott is shot to death on film, even when you have African-American men who are unarmed being murdered by white police officers, even when you have the president-elect saying some pretty disgusting things that are caught on film, we still have a segment of America that says, there's nothing to see here. There's no problem. We don't see what you see. So even capturing America's ugly side of racism and displaying it before the world, there are some people who choose to still put their head in the sand like an ostrich and pretend that it's not problematic.
We talked after both the 2008 and the 2012 elections, and other times in between here on this program and in other forums, about what did it mean that an African American had been elected president. And there were those people, as you know, who said, that really says something has really changed in America. And it was an indicator of change, but still, it was very clear there were an awful lot of people that didn't deal with that well, that weren't comfortable having a black person in charge leading the country. And you pointed out at the time, remember, a majority of white voters voted for Barack Obama, as is generally true with the Democratic presidential candidate. It now seems we've seen those folks who were not comfortable, who for whatever reason couldn't accept it, get together with other conservative folks who may not have had a particular racial problem, but they've taken over a major political party, and they've elected a president who's now appointing an attorney general who has a rather questionable past in terms of racial relations, and a top advisor to the president who was head of a website, Breitbart website, I'm talking about Steve Bannon, obviously, which has published some unbelievably racist and particularly the things I've read a couple times, anti-Semitic things. Something's really happening.
Yeah, when Barack Obama was elected, there were those who thought that we had went into this post-racial era. The night that he was elected, right here in Springfield, an African-American church was burned to the ground by three Caucasian young men who were upset about his election. Subsequent to his election, hate crimes went up across the nation. We had the rise of the Tea Party. We had an onset of an American citizenry who no longer respected the office of the president or the man who sat in that office because he was an African American. We had the most disrespected president in the history of America. And I think though Barack Obama's election showed the great potential for change in America, it also revealed an underside, an ugly side of America that has crescendoed into the election of Donald Trump. And now we see a President-elect Trump take a man like Jeff Sessions and make him Attorney General. Think about it for a moment. The Senate in the 1980s said Jeff Sessions was too racist to be a judge. We're talking about senators who voted against MLK's birthday being a holiday, who said Jeff Sessions was too racist. Now, it's got to be bad when white racists say that you're too racist. And now this is the person who is going to be the Attorney General if he is confirmed. Mr. Bannon of Breitbart. This is indicative of the type of individuals that Donald Trump feels comfortable with. Yet he stood there in his victory speech and he committed to be a president for all of America. And yet his first three major picks have said, I'm not going to be your president. Hence the hashtag that's trending now on Twitter, not my president. I think we're in for a rocky 4 years.
Well, let's talk about that from your official position leading the NAACP here in our area. That's an organization that it is dedicated to guaranteeing equality for people of color. You're busy anyway. You anticipate 4 years or who knows how long a future of tremendous activity. I presume that you will have to be out guarding and complaining and pointing out to people.
Yeah, some years ago, after David Dinkins was no longer the mayor of New York and Rudy Giuliani, another Trump surrogate, came into office, there were African Americans who were being abused by the police who had reported that police officers were telling them it's Giuliani time. I think there are many who now feel it's Trump time. The election of Donald Trump has emboldened a segment of America who, for whatever reason, feels a certain way about people of color. The days after his election, we saw a spike in hate crimes happening. And that element now feels as though they are now empowered to spew their racist vitriol and to act in a manner that is completely anti-American because the man who is going to sit in the Oval Office has demonstrated that kind of behavior right in front of them.
Let me bring you locally something you're talking about right now. There's talk of a police commission being put together for the city of Springfield, independent of the police department. Currently, the police commissioner basically is the head of the police department, the police chief, if you will. This would differentiate. Why do you think that's important?
I think it's important because any police department needs to be accountable to its citizenry. I think real civilian review is important, particularly in a city like Springfield. Years ago, they took the powers of the police commission, abolished the commission, vacated the position of police chief, and created a police commissioner that was endued with the powers of the commission, but reports directly to the mayor. They have a police community review board that is only advisory in its capacity. The mayor often boasts that the commissioner has always heeded their advice or exceeded their recommendations. What he doesn't tell you is that many of the cases that the commissioner acts on, the review board never sees them. Case in point, the controversial case that is before us now in the city of Springfield with Officer Bigda, that review board never saw that case, never reviewed that case, never made a recommendation to the commissioner. The commissioner takes a man who, by all accounts, should have been fired, and upon the recommendation of the city solicitor and the Human Resources Department, gave him a 6-month suspension. Here's a man who threatened to kill 2 individuals. He told one, "I'll take you in the parking lot and kill you." He told another one he would crush their skull, that he would plant evidence on them and send them away for 15 years. This man has no right to wear a badge or a uniform, and yet they were so worried about it being overturned in civil service that they gave him a slap on the wrist. I believe that we need civilian oversight. I believe we need a police commission that can act independently of the mayor, the city solicitor, the Human Resources Department, and can make those hard decisions and not have to be concerned with whether or not it will be overturned by civil service, but can do the right thing. And I think it's absolutely necessary.
Bishop Talbert Swan, thanks for your perspective. Thanks as always for coming in, sir.
My pleasure.